Hi, this is Mike Verta, member of the Maxwell Render beta team. In this program, we're going to be covering creating basic materials in Maxwell. Now, there are a number of ways that you can build materials in Maxwell. You can either use the Material Editor interface built into the Studio application, or you can use the standalone editor called MXED. A third choice is you can work inside your host application of choice. Mine is Maya via plugin. That's what I'm fastest at, most proficient in, so that's what I'll be doing. But no matter what application you work in, the parameters and controls for materials are all the same. There's almost 100% parity between the platforms, so any of the controls that you see me touching here will have the same names, same value ranges, etc. So you should have no problem working in whatever platform you choose. But before we actually begin building any materials, we have to get an environment set up that's appropriate for it. And that means a neutral environment that is properly balanced exposure-wise so that we can trust what we're seeing. And to begin this process, I like to start with primitives. Cubes, spheres, they're efficient geometry, so that means that they'll render very quickly as we're doing tests. And, you know, I may be doing hundreds of these tests over the course of a project, and so I rarely will use my final geometry because it tends to be heavier. So I've got a primitive or two here, and then you need a ground plane. And ground plane is important because you have to have something to capture shadows or caustics if you have them. And you also need something to provide reflections. If you have a reflective material and nothing to reflect, it's very difficult to gauge what it's doing. So a simple ground plane, not too big. You don't need the boundaries of the scene to be too large. What you don't want to do is enclose your scene in a cube or a room of any kind. Even though it would provide a reflection environment, the problem with it is that you've now substantially increased the number of bounces, indirect bounces that Maxwell has to calculate for a scene, and that's going to slow down your render tests tremendously. Don't do it. You don't need to do it. It's better to have as lean and mean a scene as you possibly can. So here we've just got the sphere and a ground plane, and as you see, I set up a couple of emitter planes to illuminate the sphere. And that's really all you need. I use emitter planes instead of the built-in lighting options in Maxwell like Physical Sky and Sun and Sky Dome for a number of reasons. Let me illustrate why it is not a good idea to use, say, the sun as a light source. I'm just going to hide my emitters here, and let me assign just a generic material to a generic white material to these two objects. What I'm doing here is I'm just selecting a basic Maxwell material, setting its reflectance, which is shorthand. We'll talk about this, but you can consider that the color. And the next most important aspect is the roughness. It's a fully rough surface, which is a special Lambert mode in Maxwell. It's a value of 100. And having done that, I'm going to assign that material, and then I'm going to select my Physical Sky and Sun as the lighting source. All right, and now let me do a render test on this and show you why this is not a good idea. You'll see right away in the render that the sun casts a color on the surface of the sphere and on the ground plane. In this case, the sun's kind of low in the atmosphere, and it's a sunset, so it's a yellow, creamy kind of lighting. And while it's pretty, it's polluting the surface color. It's no longer pure white, so it's throwing me off. I can't judge accurately what the colors of my sphere are supposed to be. And this is true no matter what time of day you set the sun for. The sun has a color, and the Physical Sky has a color. So you don't want to use Physical Sky and Sun, even if your final lighting is an outdoor. Build your lighting build your material in a neutral environment. Okay. You also don't want to use Sky Dome. Sky Dome has an advantage over Physical Sky in that you could set it to be a neutral color, so you're not going to pollute your color of your surface. But it has another significant drawback, which is that it tends to make it very difficult to judge things about your material. Let me show you an example of that to show you why you also don't want to use Sky Dome. Here I'm assigning a material I've previously built to my sphere, and I'm rendering with Sky Dome. Okay, so right away you see, well, it's not polluted with color, but it's also what's going on with the surface. I mean, I don't even know what this is. Is that a texture map with the dark area in the center? I don't know. It's very difficult to tell what this material is doing. I'm going to stop the render. I'm going to save that so we can compare it later. But now, doing nothing else to the scene, not touching a thing except changing the lighting from turning off SkyDome, and I'm going to re-enable my emitter planes. Okay, I'm just going to re-enable the emitter planes and hit render again. And now look at the surface. Same exact material. Okay. All right. Clearly, this is a reflective material. You can see that the emitter planes are reflecting in it clearly. And there's something else showing up, and that is these little micro scratches in the surface. See those? We're at a low sample level right now, so they're a little hard to see, but they'll continue to come in. But this detail was utterly obfuscated by the use of SkyDome. I couldn't see these details at all, and obviously they're a crucial part of this material. So for that reason, I would not recommend using SkyDome. It just hides details. In this case, it hid one of the most important aspects of the material, to say nothing of the fact that it was almost impossible to tell that it was reflective. Nonetheless, this is still pretty abstract. I can't tell much about this either. At least I've got the details, but it is nowhere near as acceptable a solution. Here's the SkyDome, and here's the improved render. It's funny, once you know to look for them, you can actually kind of see the scratches in there. But the best case scenario is this sphere with the emitter planes and the ground plane. I put those three things together, and now I've got a complete picture of my material. I can tell that it's reflective because I've got the reflections happening in the surface. Because of the emitter planes, I can see the details. I can see those little micro scratches, and I'm in a much happier place. Personally, I actually go one little step further, which is instead of using a plain white ground plane, I like to use a black and white checkerboard pattern. Something with a fairly dense pattern in it. And I do that because, first of all, it's black and white, again, so it's not polluting the color of the surface with any color, but it's also a repeating pattern that's sharp. So if I've got anything going on bump-wise or like the scratches here, I can clearly see it by the effect it has on the reflection. So this is my preferred setup, and I use emitter planes. Primarily in my material tests for a number of reasons. But of course, it's not the only option. You could also light with an HDR map. But the reason I use emitter planes is because, well, first of all, they're easy to position, and I can resize them if I need to. But they also don't suffer from any sort of resolution limitation, which an HDRI map can. And if it does have a resolution limitation, you can end up with pixelation in the reflection, and that'll make it difficult to see your surface. Nonetheless, I do use them from time to time. Here's a map that I use. It's a 6K map that I got from HDRIstudio.com. It's neutral 10, by the way, if you're interested. And it's big enough that it won't pixelate in the reflection. Also, I had to convert it to black and white because it did have a little bit of color in it. And again, you don't want to pollute your surface. So I use that map and in place of emitters from time to time. Let me show you, for example, here I'm selecting that map as an HDRI environment to light the scene in. And what I usually do, actually, when I load the map, I usually hide it from being directly visible, just so it's not distracting where I'm still getting the illumination and reflection of it. But again, any HDRI map that you're going to light with, you've got to be cognizant of its resolution, and it needs to be black and white. To me, in this case, the map is almost exactly what my emitters setup looks like, and so the results are, as you'll see, predictably similar. It's three emitters showing up as a lighting source. And in this case, actually, if you start to look, you can see that this map is doing an even better job than my emitter planes of revealing those scratches in the surface. And that's often the case where I get I'll go back and forth between my emitter planes and one or two of these HDRI maps, very similar, that I use to just make sure that I'm getting the best representation of what my material looks like. There's a little loading time with any map, so if you're using a 6K map like this, it may take a little bit of time to load. That's something to consider. Also, you may notice that it seems like your HDR map hits a higher sample level sooner than using emitter planes. And at low sample levels, it may look a little cleaner. In truth, it tends to be actually a little noisier, even though it's at a higher sampling level. It depends on the map. It depends on where you got it and the resolution of it and the rest of it. I find for really low sample level tests, like when I'm doing the early materials tests, it's best to use an HDR map. But if I'm going up into higher sample levels and I want it to clear up better, I actually will switch back to emitters. That's just a personal preference, but you may find you have a similar experience. Now, sometimes I will use one or two other HDR map options for reflections as I get further along in the materials, but in development. But in any case, they're always converted black and white. Here's one I use. It's like a barracks. It's slightly more. It's just slightly more interesting and allows me to test a material in a slightly different context. And again, it's a black and white map. It didn't come that way, but it's also high enough resolution that it doesn't tend to break up, and it allows me to have some variation in terms of my reflections. So now we're almost there. We have a primitive and a ground plane. We've got reflection source and an emitter source. But what we have to do now is possibly the most important part of this process, and that is calibrate for the exposure. Here I've assigned a dark black material to the sphere and to the ground plane. And I want to show you, when you render in Maxwell, the exposure is relative. So as this material comes up, okay, well, there it's black, but by simply moving the shutter speed, I could make this gray. Or I could make it white. I could blow it out completely. Which one is it? If you don't set a neutral exposure point that you can trust, you'll never know. Now, from a workflow standpoint, let me show you my approach to shutter speed. The first thing to consider is that you've got two controls. You've got ISO, and you've got the actual shutter speed. ISO is roughly equivalent to the old film ASA. It's the film speed, and both sliders are fully interactive. They've got ranges, and they're actually redundant. To have this level of control. In the real world, film ISO speeds are highly regimented. There's really only 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, and I think 3200. So I will leave my ISO at one of those values and simply control my exposure using shutter speed. You have exactly as much control, and the exposure is relative, just depending on how much you leave the shutter open, how much light you leave in. So what we need to do using these controls is set, well, what is the neutral point? What is the actual exposure? Well, let me show you how to do it. I'm going to do it first, and then explain to you why I did it this particular way. Let me create a material, a default Maxwell material. The roughness is 100. The default index of refraction, it's labeled ND, you can remember it as index, is set to 3.0. And in this mode, which is a Lambert mode, really the only parameter which controls its color is reflectance. You can think of reflectance as color. It's essentially color, but technically speaking, color is the result of reflectance. Light bounces off a surface, and depending on what the wavelength of that light is the color we see. That's why it's called reflectance. It is also representative of the percentage of light that's bouncing off of a surface and coming back at the camera. Now, to calibrate your lighting, you want to set the exposure for the brightest part of the scene. And for us, that is not going to be represented by pure white, which would be RGB value 255 or HSV value 1.0. But in fact, is value 0.95 in HSV, 95%, which is an RGB value of 242. And I'll explain in a moment why we're using 242 and not 255. But what you do is you create a material like we did here with 242 as the value and assign it to the sphere and to the ground plane and render your scene. And then what you want to do is you want to set your exposure to just below the point where the image starts to bloom, or starts to blow out, specifically where the brightest point in the image measures exactly 242 if you bring it into Photoshop and measure it, say, with the eyedropper tool. Okay, so what you want to know is, look, you put in 242 as the color of the surface, and what's coming out on the render measures exactly 242 at its brightest point, which will be on usually on the side of the sphere here with this lighting. Now, what that exposure is going to be different depending on your scene. How big are your emitters? What intensity are you using for them? How close are they to the sphere? What's your f-stop on the camera? There's a number of things that are going to change this exposure, so you're going to have to calibrate it yourself. Now, what I did is I took the time one day to just go ahead and on this scene and play with the values until I had what I knew was a trustworthy exposure. So whatever color I put in, that's the color I get out. And then once I had it, I lock it. You don't touch it again. Now let's go back to that question, which was, why did we use 242 and not 255 as the value of white, as the value of the brightest our scene is going to be? Well, reflectance, as I mentioned, is the percentage of light coming back at the camera, and value 255 means it's 100% of the light coming back at a camera, and this is just not physically, it doesn't exist. There's a couple of space-age materials get pretty darn close, but average materials as a reference point, super bright white piece of paper gets 92%. 92%, which is an RGB value of 235. There are some white paints, automotive paints, that get around 95%, which is an RGB value of 242, and that's what I consider the upper limit for setting reflectance. 95%. Some people are very conservative. They don't go much above 200. I think that's a little on the conservative side, especially because there are everyday materials that go to 95%. So since you're going for photorealism, I always recommend work within real-world values. If you start with this 100% reflectance, you've already handicapped yourself. This doesn't exist in a practical sense. But I'm going to give you another reason now not to go above 242. Here's a couple of renders. On the left side is a room that was rendered with RGB 242, and on the right side with the RGB 255. Now, this was lit with the sun coming down. It's got a yellowing color. And if you look on the left side, the yellow sunlight, it's properly casting its yellow coloring onto the walls. Whereas on the right side, it's blown out white. And it's not only just blown out white, its details, the details are getting washed out. The indirect bounces, you look here next to the camera, the indirect bounce quality has gone down. It's also a noisier scene and a slower scene. This is really uncool. You don't want to do that. You want to stay at 242 and not at 255 so that your renders aren't overly noisy, that the indirect bounces don't start to degrade and you're in hell. Don't just trust me. 242 is easily the upper limit for Maxwell. And this is true for colors as well. Pure colors. It's not quite as noticeable, but the effects are no less prevalent. So if you look at for example, one of my texture maps, like here's a placement grid that I use. If you look at the colors and measure them, you'll see the white is 242. Any of the solid colors are all measuring 242 if you look at the green or the blue or the red. And I do that with all of my materials, and it stops me from having those indirect bounce problems. It stops me from having detail washing out problems. It gets a more accurate solution. It's less noisy. It's faster. All the good things. It's just all good. So 242. It's a magic number. You will create a measurable difference in your scenes and in your experience. And so again, that's 242 for the reflectance 0 parameter, especially if your roughness is 100, which is a Lambert mode. And we're going to get into the rest of that in just a moment. But we couldn't go any further until we had our scene calibrated. But now it is. You're ready to go. And because it's properly balanced, if I'm to take any texture map here, or texture material, and apply it to, let's see, the sphere, and then a black and white checker to the floor, this render now, because I'm properly calibrated, will come back predictably to look just like the texture map that I created for it. So if we go and look at the map in Photoshop, that's actually on that little sphere. It's a picture of the my garage floor. And we bring up the render. The render has only been going for a short time right now, so it's a little difficult to see. But the values of that map will match predictably with my original texture map. Within, I'd say this is a 95, 98% accuracy. If you want 100% accuracy, you use the standard materials scene that ships with Maxwell with our patented symbol. You've seen that. That's in all the MXM gallery previews. That scene is absolutely 100% calibrated perfectly. It's the most accurate you could ever hope to see what your material looks like. For me, this is 98%. It's close enough. I'm ready to move on to the next stage of materials, and we will do that now.